Welcome back to those who were here for the first session this morning, and welcome to those of you who have just arrived for this second session of today on our Brain and Mind Day, produced by Professors Fred Mendelsohn and Trevor Kilpatrick. Thank you to them for doing that. We are meeting here on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, traditional custodians of the land, and we pay respects to elders past and present. You will have noticed the bunjil nest as you came through. For those of you for whom this is your first session at the Festival of Ideas, we're encouraging you all to take a stake and write a message, and we're going to build a nest which has little form but much meaning, as discussed on the first day of the opening night of the Festival of Ideas. It's been a great festival so far. Also welcome back to Glyn Davis, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, and the Chair of the Festival of Ideas, Fiona Stanley. We would encourage you to keep your mobile phones on, but silent, and tweet using the hashtag UOMFOI. Only take you a moment to register for Twitter if you haven't already done so. Almost all of you will have a smartphone. Not everybody's using it like a smartphone. Liam Gage Brown from the Melbourne University Debating Society is moderating your tweets. And we'd quite like you to tweet questions or comments for the panel as you go along. So some of you tweeting comments like reportage, or telling your social network what's happening and so on, which is fantastic. But some of you also might have questions or comments for the panel, and feel free to tweet those questions to Liam, and Liam will bring them in as we go through the panel discussion. We have poll voting at the end of the session after the panel discussion, where we explore the ideas, and that will become obvious to you, but it's another reason for having your phone on, because you're going to have to text your polling. And it's not for who gave the best talk, it's for what you consider the highest priority moving forward, because we're going to bring together, this is a Festival of Ideas, and tomorrow afternoon at the final session of the Festival of Ideas, after our Democracy Day, we're going to bring together the highest priority ideas in terms of, does it give us some sort of menu for action or research or otherwise in the academy or outside the academy. So a very exciting notion that we will actually, this is not just a trivial exercise, we're actually trying to build on the ideas to which you're contributing. When I was at medical school, we were kind of taught that there was a bit in your brain that did that, and a bit of the brain that did that, and 1963 was up here. And of course, we now know that is a completely fallacious notion of how the brain works. The brain works in terms of distributed networks. The stronger these networks, the more resilient these networks, going to what we did in the first session, the better for us. But what is social networking doing to the networking in our brain, and where does all this fit? And that's only part of what we're talking about in this session here today, and you will contribute to that discussion later. Our first presenter, and it's again for those of you who haven't been here, they are 10-minute talks, and we throw people off stage if they go over 10 minutes, and they're putting a proposition to you and arguing that proposition as they go through. And our first proposition comes from Pip Patterson, who is Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at the University of Melbourne, and her academic career was based her reputation is centred on her career as a quantitative psychologist working in the development of mathematical models for social and behavioural phenomena, which are not as easy to understand as we might think, and certainly anybody who went to the first session would realise that if they didn't know it already, and is particularly interested in social networks and network-based social processes. Please welcome Professor Pip Patterson.
Thank you. I want to make 4 points in this presentation. First, it can be useful to predict social behaviour. To illustrate this point, I refer to studies on the transmission of hepatitis C virus, or HCV, amongst intravenous drug users. In these studies, completed with colleagues at this university and the Burnett Institute, We've used fragments of data on injecting partner networks amongst intravenous drug users in Melbourne, shown on the left, to develop models that allow us to predict probabilistically the form of injecting partner networks at community level, illustrated on the right. We've also carefully modelled the process of hepatitis C virus transmission in these networks. We've then combined these two models to simulate transmission of HCV in community populations. The value of this joint model is that it allows us to undertake what-if investigations of different approaches to HCV treatment. As a result, we have demonstrated, for example, that it's more effective to treat infected cases, take that one, and their infected partners, than to treat exactly the same total number of randomly selected infected cases. This is a potentially important finding for treatment regimes. My second point is that techniques developed to predict one kind of social interaction behaviour, such as injecting drugs together, are helpful in predicting another. This is because of the important role of social proximity in the prediction of most forms of social interaction. Individuals are more likely to interact if they have similar characteristics, similar backgrounds, interests or cultural tastes, they have shared affiliations, such as in family, work, school, community organisations, they are geographically close, and importantly, if they share contacts or their contacts are connected or they are otherwise close in the global network that connects us all. This last form of proximity makes models for network evolution complex, since the emergence of new interactions changes the proximity of other individuals in a network, potentiating a cascade of further interactions. Models like the one we've built for the injecting network allow us to infer how different aspects of social proximity matter for different types of social interaction. For the injecting network, sharing a locale clearly matters, as does being of a similar age, having a similar frequency of drug use, and having shared injecting partners. When we move to internet-enabled social interactions, such as the use of social media, the same principle of social proximity applies, but dependence on specific aspects of social proximity generally differs. Geographical proximity and social background may be less important, for example, but shared tastes and shared connections with others may have heightened importance. The prediction of online interactions is also distinctive because data are often recorded with a level of detail and scale previously unprecedented. This richness of data leads to privacy concerns. An attempt by Harvard researchers to use data on the Facebook engagements of a cohort of undergraduate students from a large northeastern private college created an early privacy furore. In the ensuing debate, it not only became clear which college was involved, but some individual students could be easily identified from the anonymised data made available by the researchers. Furthermore, the relevant institutional review board had not judged it necessary to seek students' consent on the use of data. What makes privacy a particular issue here is the connected nature of the data. Not only does information about network neighbours help to predict the interaction of other individuals, but it also helps to identify everyone. Predicting social networks therefore requires really careful treatment of privacy concerns. A recent UK study demonstrates just how much information can be inferred from publicly accessible digital records. Kaczynski and colleagues obtained Facebook likes from 58,000 consenting adults and also asked them to complete a survey about less public information. They showed that these less public attributes could be predicted from the publicly accessible information of the Facebook likes to a surprising degree. For example, 93% correct classification on gender, 88% correct classification on men's sexual orientation, 85% on political views, and quite reasonable predictions of intelligence and personality traits as well. The cultural information implicit in a set of Facebook likes conveys a great deal about us, much more than we may realise. My third point is that we are already learning quite a lot about the online social world. I'll mention just 3 findings. First, there's a significant overlap between offline and online social networks. To a substantial extent, online media are used to support and enhance the relationships that we maintain offline. And these additional channels allow interpersonal networks to take a greater diversity of forms and to range over larger geographical distances. This finding echoes the results of an apocryphal early study on the use of email within organisations, that the primary purpose of most email messages was to set up face-to-face meetings. Second, the new media do nonetheless lead to new forms of social relationship, and not all of these are positive. A recent Korean study showed that high numbers of non-reciprocated relationships on Twitter and social network sites are accompanied by high levels of loneliness and low interpersonal trust. Perhaps unsurprisingly, high numbers of both reciprocated and non-reciprocated relationships were associated with a measure of addiction to social network sites. Third, although it's often claimed that online interaction is devoid of the subtle non-verbal cues that characterise face-to-face interaction, Cornell linguist Joseph Walter and colleagues have recently provided contrary evidence. They showed that communicators could produce equivalent emotional interpretations in interaction partners in either face-to-face or online settings, supporting Walter's view that people can adapt to the medium by using contextual and stylistic cues to imbue verbal messages with subtle information about attitudes and emotions. What these and other studies suggest is that the internet adds increasing diversity to our social networks, both in the range of network partners and in the forms of interaction through which we engage with them. So my final point concerns the consequence of this added diversity for our social worlds. The changing mix of interaction forms is leading to subtle but discernible changes in the fabric of our social worlds, primarily because of the changing importance of the different forms of underpinning social proximity I mentioned earlier. Canadian sociologist Barry Wellman has pointed to three highly stylised network forms from the early part of the 20th century to the present. Oops. In the early part of the last century, he argues groups dominated our social worlds, shown on the top left. The relevant groups included family, work groups, social groups, religious groups, and so on. And many of these groups had overlapping memberships and transacted their day-to-day lives in the same general neighbourhood. A second form emerged with substantial changes in transportation and communication, with increasing importance assigned to network connections maintained over longer distances, though individuals remained connected to groups as well. Ties across group boundaries and new long-range ties increased diversity in forms of connectivity. The injecting network we saw earlier is primarily of this form. The third form is associated with the rise of internet-enabled communication. Wellman refers to this as networked individualism, a personalised wireless world in which individuals shift readily across different types of network interactions and different network partners. Ties are more dynamic and even less geographically or group bounded, reflecting the more dynamic forms of social proximity on which they depend, changing tastes and interests, and a more fluid set of social connections. This shift brings new opportunities and challenges to both individuals and communities. But as the case of the injecting network illustrated, understanding networks and their consequences in particular settings can yield valuable insights for action on particular issues and problems. I contend that we'll need to understand the changing impacts of our networked worlds. My proposition is therefore that we must engage in and support problem-oriented scholarship in the humanities and social sciences if we're to understand and respond to the challenges and opportunities of our evolving digital world. Thank you.
Thanks, Pip. Nothing like starting with a bit of social contagion to get on with. And talking about social contagion, hashtag UOMFOI, keep your tweets coming in, and any questions or comments you have, as well as your reportage to your wide social networks from here, which will no doubt number in the hundreds of thousands given the spread of social networking. Our next presenter is trying to decrease the fear of those over a certain age in this room that social networking is the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it. Shenton Chang is in the Department of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, and his research interests include young people's online behaviour and its impact on education, mental well-being and social networking. Please welcome Shenton.
Thank you. I'm going to be walking a little bit. I'm a bit of a wanderer, so I hope you don't mind me walking up and down. To begin with, I'm a bit of a Luddite compared to a lot of my colleagues in the Department of Computing and Information Systems. For example, I do not use Twitter. I've never tweeted in my life. So yeah, shame on me, according to my colleagues. So I think I'm the perfect person to actually say, you know, why we should be using it or not be using it, because I'm kind of arm's length from it, in a way. My job today is to talk a little bit about what's actually happening out there in the social network world. What are people actually doing with the technology? But I want to start with the technology itself. In the world of technology and the internet, there are heaps of people who are doing research both professionally and in academia that's basically really looking at how to make technology idiot-proof. Right? This is why your 2-year-old toddler and grandchildren know how to use a smartphone. Okay? You don't need to teach them. They know how to swipe it. They go up to the television and they do that. And they go, why isn't your TV working? Right? Because your TV is not idiot-proof. Just try and struggle with the controls and you know it's not idiot-proof. But the smartphone and all sorts of internet technologies, the whole idea is to make it so simple to use. And the reason is simple. To make it so simple to use that it actually just attunes to human behavior. You know, it basically just accentuates what you are already naturally inclined to do. Does that make sense? Right? So that's the purpose of technology. So when we think about how that actually enhances human behavior, the more I do research in that space, I'm starting to conclude, not quite ready to say definitely, but I'm starting to shift towards this idea that the more things change, the more we remain the same as human beings. All right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So let's begin. So I was originally going to title this. What was that? You were talking to me. Sorry, I was SMSing my partner and answering a Facebook, FB, for those of you not, message while tagging you on where we are. Yes, now you have my attention. Now we can start talking. But they thought that this was a ridiculous title, so we've got human connections in the internet information age. So the first question we want to ask is, if there is so much information out there, why aren't we more educated and informed as a society? Why aren't people more aware? There's a book out there called The World's Dumbest Generation. I don't know if you've heard of it. You know, that basically says that young people are just dumb because they know nothing. They can't even do long division without a calculator. Sorry, a computer or a smartphone, right? I want to challenge that, okay? And I want to start by showing you this. This is work that we've done that talks about human behavior and how we seek out information. And it's actually to point out things that have been around for a very long time. And I just want to point out to you that we all have information needs. We all have information needs. At some point in our life, even in the next 2 hours, we're going to be looking for some new information somewhere. Right? The challenge is to recognize where we are. There are some information needs where we recognize we need and we actually seek it out. Does that make sense? That's why you seek out information. There's also information up in the green corner where we recognize we kind of need, but we choose to ignore it. You know, it's better not to know. Those of you who are dealing with trying to quit smoking, for example, those of us who are dealing with diet and nutrition, it's better not to know, right? So that's the green bit. But it is a need. It is a need. It's an information need that we choose to ignore. Then you've got the what we call the unrecognized but demanded needs, the yellow bit. This is really the kind of needs that we kind of know that something is not quite right, but we're not sure where to ask for information. Does that happen to you ever? Right? And you go to Google and it's not very helpful because you need keywords and you don't have those keywords, right? And then you've got the clueless. No idea what they need and they're not looking for it, right? So that's at some point or other, we're going to fall into that corner, right? And so we go to Google, we go to the internet, and we think that Wikipedia is going to solve everything for us, okay? And this kind of explains why is it that even though all the information out there, whether it's true or not, we are sometimes so ignorant, right? Because at the end of the day, we seek out only the things that we recognize that we want, okay? And so this reflects a little bit back on what Professor Patterson was talking about, that online relationships are sometimes reflection of our offline relationships. So we continue to just hang out with our people, right? Okay. So what are the characteristics of online social networking, the early indicators? The first one is time. Time is of the essence. And earlier on, I talked about this idea that the more things change, the more we remain the same. I wanted you to imagine that this was 1972, okay? 1972, and it's Friday, and you've just received quite bad, atrocious service from a major departmental store. See, nothing much has changed. So, and you bought this thing and you brought it home and it is not working and you were very annoyed with them in the first place, and so you want to make a complaint. You have to make a complaint. So how would you make a complaint in 1972? You would go to your study and take out your beautifully embossed paper with your name at the bottom with flowers on the side to write your letter of complaint. And you will write the first one and it's not grammatically correct, so you crumple it and you write another one and you want to check that it's correct, right? By the time you get to your third person, you are still maintaining the rage. You realize you don't have an envelope or a stamp. Okay, and because it was 1972, Australia Post is not open on Saturday. You have to maintain the rage on Saturday. And then on Sunday, some of you might be going to church, and you still can maintain the rage after the church service. And on Monday, you are the first in line at Australia Post to buy a stamp. Will that actually happen? You have had time, haven't you? If it was yesterday that you bought something really bad from this departmental store and you were not happy, you would go directly to their Facebook page and make a complaint and make it very public immediately, right? Is your behavior different? It's that anger. The difference is time, convenience, and access. The more things change, the more we remain the same, right? So time is of the essence. So we talk about young people not thinking it through. I mean, when we were young, we didn't think it through either, but we didn't have the internet to show it off, right? So ultimately, it is a social thing. And if it's social, we talk about one to many. We talk about many to one. Okay? And we talk about many to many, this idea that Pip has already talked about earlier on. But what's important is that it's supposed to be democratic. So anyone could theoretically have a voice, anyone can share information, anyone can watch, and boundaries become self-defined. Okay? What you want to watch is up to you, right? So what Priest and Schneiderman talk about is this idea that even on the internet, not everyone is equal. You've got people who are up the top, the readers and the members, those of you who just read and consume a lot of information. And then you've got the second part, the contributors. These are people who put, I like this, without saying too much, okay? Then you've got collaborators, those people who just share so much of other people's work, okay? And finally, the leaders, the people who actually generate discussion and start talking. They're what I call lurkers, likers, linkers, and leaders, right? Now, Australia, it's been shown in a number of research that in Australia, most of us are lurkers. Okay, that is why there is so little Australian content on the internet. We consume a lot of other people's, there are some words I just can't use, nonsense out there. Okay, so, but just how social is it? If we look at this, the notion that there are different roles and styles and interactions implies that there is a difference between sociality, just being social, communality, working together as a community, or simple, we're just connected, it doesn't mean anything, right? So I think we have to have a better more sophisticated understanding of what we mean by social media and what it means when people say they are connected to each other. Does it actually mean communality, which is great? Sociality, which is kind of like an after work drinks, which doesn't mean anything? Or is it actually meaningful communality? they cannot be taken to mean the same thing. Okay, just because your child has 300 Facebook friends, it doesn't mean anything. So my proposition is this: we need to understand that social media is not a social evil. Only then can wiser heads help to contribute and to harness the positive potentials of social media for the future. And this is why we shouldn't be banning social media in schools. Schools should be taking it on and talking to the kids about what it means to be a good internet citizen. Thank you.
Now, no lurkers. You're all linkers. Hashtag UOMFOI. I'm a destroyer, sorry. And I hope you weren't wanting that, Alex, for your presentation. Our next presenter is Alex Fornito, who is at the Melbourne Neuropsychiatry Centre at the University of Melbourne, particularly interested in complex network science and understanding brain connectivity and how brain connectivity can lead to psychiatric disorders. Please welcome Alex Fornito.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? All right, so I've moved. I'm at Monash University now. Just full disclosure. So I have to start with a confession, and I'm actually worse than Shanton. I don't do Twitter, and I actually don't have a Facebook account. So I don't blog. I don't use Snapchat. I don't use Instagram. I've never uploaded a selfie. But I do email a lot. I use SMS as required. I use the web enough to know that I should Google something if I need to find an answer. So although I'm a bit of a social pariah, I'm not a complete technophobe. But the thing that scares me is that I'm really struggling to keep up with all these new technologies. And it's really scary when you think that a lot of these didn't exist until a few years ago, even though the fact is that now they're very much an integral part of many people's lives. Now, this uptake seems to be particularly rapid in teenagers, and it's been said that we're in the midst of a revolution. So prominent US child and adolescent psychiatrist Jay Geed has said that the way adolescents of today learn, play and interact has changed more in the past 15 years than in the previous 570 since the popularisation of Gutenberg's printing press. Right, so that's quite a bold statement, and here's some data to back it up. So this slide plots the time taken for new technologies to reach 50 million users since their introduction. So a higher bar means a longer time. So you can see with radio, it took just under 40 years to get to 50 million users. With telephone, about 20 years. TV, a bit over 10. Then with the World Wide Web, Facebook and Twitter, each under 5 years. But then if you look at Google Plus over here, which is a suite of social apps promoted by Google, it took about 3 months to get to 50 million users. Right? So not only are these technologies revolutionising the way we interact with the world, but these changes are happening at an accelerating rate. And when you consider that teenagers spend about 8+ hours a day interacting with these media, and this figure seems to be increasing over time, it raises concerns about what it's doing to the brain. And the concern is particularly acute in teenage years because we know the brain is still under construction. So this is an image, you can think of it as a zoomed in section of a small bit of brain, and what we've done is we've drawn the neurons. So the neurons are thinking cells of the brain. So each point represents a neuron, and the lines linking them are the connections between the neurons. And these connections allow the neurons to communicate with each other, so much like two friends would on Facebook. So this is what your brain looks like at birth, and you're pretty much born with all the neurons you're going to have throughout life at birth. The brain is one of the few organs of the body that doesn't continually regenerate its cells, apart from a few exceptions. So you have all the neurons you're going to have at birth, but what happens is during childhood, your brain starts to make a lot more connections between all these cells. So you start to get this forest-like appearance here. And in fact, the brain makes a lot more connections than you're ever going to need throughout your life. So then throughout late childhood and early adolescence, some of these connections start to get pruned back according to a use it or lose it rule. So connections that are used frequently strengthen and remain. Connections that aren't used weaken and they wither away and disappear. So much like an artist sculpting a statue from an undifferentiated mass of stone, this developmental process of an initial exuberance followed by a gradual pruning back allows the brain to adapt to its environment. So the brain keeps what it needs and eliminates what it doesn't. So the question is, what does doing this 8 hours a day do to the brain? So I should say this is not sped up. This is a video of a World Championship level video game player. And in South Korea, video games are treated very seriously. The championships are played in packed stadiums in front of thousands of people. And the skill of these players is rated in something called actions per minute, which is the number of button presses and clicks they can do per minute. And top level players are at about 300 actions per minute. So that's about 5 per second, right? So that's an extraordinary level of skill. And so if our kids are doing this 8 hours a day instead of spending their time socialising with friends or kicking the football, what's it doing to their brain? This issue has drawn the attention of a lot of prominent public figures. So Baroness Susan Greenfield, who's a prominent UK neuroscientist, member of the House of Lords, has said that she thinks the issue is almost as important as climate change and that the very quality of our existence is threatened. She's gone on to say that her fear is that these technologies are infantilising the brain into the state of small children who are attracted by buzzing noises and bright lights and who have a small attention span and live for the moment, much like Shanton's original title for his talk. Nicholas Carr, a journalist, has written a book on the issue, which was actually a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And he said that we run the risk of turning into pancake people, spread wide and thin as we connect with the vast network of information accessed by the mere touch of a button. So quite a scary view of the society we're all headed towards. And in some cases, these fears are well-founded. So there does seem to be an emerging category of addictions related to internet usage. And this is an example of a particularly bad case where 2 parents in South Korea became so addicted to an online role-playing game that they completely neglected their newborn child. So they would spend 12 hours a day playing this game, looking after their own virtual child rather than their real child, and the infant died. So in many cases, these addictions can be just as severe as heroin or cocaine addiction. And in our own work, we've shown that these addictions do change certain circuits in the brain. But what about more moderate patterns of use? What does that do to our brain? Well, the jury's still out. For as many studies as you can find that find a negative effect on things like attention, concentration, memory, you can find studies that find a positive effect. And we shouldn't really be surprised that engaging in video games for long periods of time changes the brain. If you learn a new sport, if you learn a musical instrument, if you learn to juggle, it's going to change your brain. This is how we learn. This is how the brain adapts to its environment. So the question is not whether it's changing our brain, it's whether these changes are for better or worse. And I think what really determines that is the content and what we're actually doing online. And to illustrate this, we can look at something I like to call the Dora principle. And so this slide summarises the results from a study done a few years ago looking at how exposure to different types of television programs for kids impacted children's language abilities. And so they looked at kids who watched Dora the Explorer and compared them to kids who didn't watch the show, and they found that at 2.5 years, these kids showed on average just under 15 more words in their vocabulary. So their development had accelerated a little bit. They then looked at kids who watched Disney, and they didn't really find any change. So there was not much difference to kids who didn't watch. Then when they looked at kids who watched Teletubbies, they actually found there was a decrease. Why is that the case? Well, cartoons such as Dora the Explorer actively engage kids and get them to repeat phrases and really get them involved and stimulate language circuits in the brain. Whereas Teletubbies doesn't really have much verbal input. The characters just sort of sit around and groan and moan a lot. So I think this slide really nicely illustrates that something like TV isn't bad in and of itself. It's what you do with it that counts. And I think the same thing applies to digital media. If you spend your time trying to understand how stars and planets form or how volcanoes erupt, then that's a productive use of time. If you spend 8 hours a day exchanging the latest celebrity gossip, well, maybe that's not such a good thing for your brain. In fact, there is some evidence that we could use social media to do good things for our brain. If you actually measure brain size and various measures of brain complexity across different species of primates, so looking at different species of monkeys and apes and humans and so on, you find there's a very strong correlation between brain complexity and the size and complexity of the social group of that species. So the more complex the social group, the larger, more complex the brain. So social pressures seem to be having an important role in driving brain evolution. Now, think about how technologies such as Facebook have revolutionised the way we interact with the world around us. We're now able to stay in closer contact with a much wider range of people than previously possible. And we can use these technologies to increase the diversity and richness of our social relationships. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Facebook is driving brain evolution, but I think it is worth considering how these technologies can be leveraged to have beneficial effects on brain function and development. So I'd like to close by returning to our video game player. Achieving this level of skill requires a lot of practice, hours locked away in a dark room in front of a screen, and it reminds me very much of what it's like to learn how to play a complicated piano piece. Another skill that requires hours of practice locked away in a room. Now, most parents wouldn't complain if they saw their kid learning how to play this, but they would complain if they saw their kid doing this all day. But in this digital age, and I'm going to be a bit provocative now, are these video game players and gifted programmers such as Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, are these the Beethovens and Mozarts of our time? And if these skills lead to successful and happy lives, are they such a bad thing? So I'm not trying to be overly optimistic. I'll just be one more second. I'm not trying to be overly optimistic, and I do think there is some validity to the concerns that have been raised, but they need to be placed in a historical context. And we humans tend to be quite anxious about new technologies. In fact, Socrates, often considered to be one of the wisest men to have ever lived, had a lot of anxiety about the introduction of writing. The Greeks had a very strong oral tradition, and he thought that writing or written words could never adequately speak for themselves, nor teach the truth adequately to others. And he thought that would cause people to cease to use their memory and become forgetful. So maybe he's right. Maybe there probably aren't many people in this room that could remember the Iliad verbatim. But few people would contend that writing has been a force for evil in our world. And I think we're on the cusp of a similar revolution here. And the internet will change the way we interact with our world, and our brains will adapt. So to close with my proposition, again, borrowing from the ancient Greeks, Aristotle said moderation in all things. And I think that's the key. We just need to be sensible about how we use these technologies. Thank you.
Great. Let's have our discussion now and invite our speakers back up to the stage with the addition of science comedian Ben McKenzie, who has a very networked brain in very odd ways. Please welcome them back to the stage. Keep your tweets coming and with the hashtag UOMFOI. If you don't have the hashtag there, we won't get them. And Liam will bring me in on the conversation when he's got something to offer. So how networked is your brain?
Very networked. I use pretty much every social networking platform that the speakers said they don't use. And
do you have any friends?
I've got a lot of friends, both in real life and
so you've met some of them
on the internet. I meet a lot of them. Actually, one of the great pleasures of my life is when I meet someone I only know on Twitter in real life for the first time. I find that to be one of the most amazing social interactions ever, because some of them just come up to you and go, hey, and some of them come up to you And I was sort of like, oh, I don't know if I should say hello. Of course you should say hello. We talk to each other all the time. And in fact, one of them is here. Where are you? Right, yep, hello, yep. Someone I know primarily, or indeed only on Twitter, is here in the audience. So that's
And have they ever changed gender when you meet them?
not so far.
Right.
But I wouldn't have a problem if they did.
Pip, just talk to me about the potency of the various networks that you're talking about, offline or online. So that hepatitis C virus network that you there, that was presumably largely a face-to-face network?
Oh, completely face-to-face, yes. People actually sitting down and injecting together.
So what you're talking about here is the concept of social contagion.
Yes.
In a sense, how things spread.
Yes.
Now, when they've done this with things like smoking and obesity in the Framingham group, that's the town in Massachusetts which they've been studying for 50-odd years, that has been to some extent face-to-face. It's who you know, who they know, and who they know, out to about 4 or 5 degrees of separation. Give me a sense of the potency in terms of influence of your behaviour of face-to-face networks versus online networks. Do we know?
Essentially, we don't know. And of course, the important thing is that each of these behaviours of interest is subtly different from the next. So injecting has a particular pattern to it and a particular consequence for the individuals involved. But if we're talking about obesity, then it's a very different kind of interaction that might be relevant to, going out to eat together in a particular place.
But isn't it also observing people? So if your group is getting fatter, you tend to get fatter, and if they're getting thinner, although it's less linked to that, you're getting thinner. How do you know that if you're, I suppose you know if you're on Facebook, we don't necessarily know if you're on Twitter.
No, I think in the online world, we just haven't got, we haven't done enough work to know what the impacts on individual behaviour are. But I mean, people do talk about the use of social networks as ways of communicating health messages, and there's certainly some very positive, early studies on that. But I don't think we know enough to know, how it works in detail.
We have a tweet comment, right, Liam?
Yeah. So, is mic on?
You're on.
So there's been a lot of discussion in your talks and in the Twitter feed about the impact that social media is having on young people. We have a tweet from Twitter user Daniela Spadaro asking that in the digital age, how can younger people learn impulse control?
Impulsively, you can go for it, Shanton.
I have a policy in my entire extended family that no child under the age of 6 should be exposed to the smartphone. And I pick up on, I think, looking at what you're saying about the development of the brain, the first 6 years are so crucial that they really need to have face-to-face interaction. They shouldn't be sitting there doing this while you're having dinner. I think it's really crucial that if we are looking at impulse control and all those sorts of things, it comes from the face-to-face interaction. I think if you give your child who is 2 years old a smartphone or an iPad to play with so that you can get on with your own life, by the time they get to teenage years and you want to start talking to them, they'll be saying, I have never spoken to you all my life. Why would I start now? And that's what I mean, like all these things actually have to be in moderation and has to be mitigated by us as adults actually interacting with them.
It's a really good question, Alex, because when they've done studies of children and offered them cakes and rewards for actually waiting to have the cake, those kids who are able to delay gratification do better through life and have a better development course. And as Shanton has said, the whole thing about these social media are just, it's time. There's no delayed gratification. What's your answer to this really good question?
I mean, I think it's like any new technology, right? If we were having this conversation 50 plus years ago with the introduction of TV, everyone would agree that we shouldn't have our kids watching television 10 hours a day, right? So similarly, we shouldn't have our kids engaging with smartphones or tablets or whatever 10 hours a day. It's just about being sensible with the technology, a bit of balance, a bit of moderation. Sure, learn how to use the technologies, but socialise as well, play a sport as well. And so the family plays an important role, particularly in the early stages.
How's your delayed gratification, Ben?
I think it's pretty good. I think the level of instant gratification on social media entirely depends on what kind of gratification you're looking for. Because sometimes it takes a long time to organise that via social media.
If ever.
If ever, yeah. I mean, but I think also that the different kinds of social media get used for very different things. And a lot of them really are, I mean, Twitter is my favourite. I love Twitter, I use it all the time. But when I say I use it all the time, I don't mean that I look at it constantly throughout the day. I usually have it sort of on in the background, and every now and then I'll pick up my phone and say, all right, people have contacted me, or if I go to an event like this and I'm not on the panel, then I would be live tweeting it, because then you're connecting to this other realm of people. And so it is instantaneous, and you do get some sort of level of gratification out of it, but I don't know that the gratification is instant. It's more the connection is instant than the gratification.
A question down here from Fiona. We'll just get a microphone to her. But I've got a question for you, Shanton, before we take that. So to draw the line, and there is a link with this instant gratification. So you want knowledge, you seek it, you get it immediately, and it's only the knowledge that you want. Yes. And you've got that. But education sits on that right-hand box, yes. Unrecognised, undemanded need. Yes. So if you want to actually learn something, to be something, you've actually got to get into that tough lower right-hand box. Yes. And the extent to which universities are falling into the trap of meeting this, you know, they've lost impulse control and are meeting the needs of their perceived needs of students rather than that tough box, which is unrecognised, undemanded need for knowledge.
Well, it's that whole demand-driven sort of thing. I think it's not necessarily going to work. I mean, one of the things that we do here at the university in particular is to actually get our students to do studies that they might otherwise not traditionally consider. So we're actually making them do something else and to consider outside their box. And I think that's really important. You know, you want to broaden the horizons, not tunnel vision them. And some of the tools on social, in the digital world, is actually tunnel vision. I mean, some people don't even read newspapers anymore. If you think about reading newspapers on a Saturday morning, you leaf through it, and sometimes you will come across interesting articles you would otherwise have never read. But people who get all their news from RSS feeds, you know, will all get only everything that they need to know about Britney Spears and nothing much else. I think that's really creating tunnel vision. So I think it's about shifting it the other way to read more widely.
But universities are saying there is a problem, and it probably predated social media, of not being able, finding it really tough to get into that lower right-hand box.
But also, you know, encouraging parents to get their kids who, for example, want to do particular areas of study to move beyond just one area of study.
After all, you are the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, academic.
Well, yes, this does bring my two worlds together. I think universities have always been in the business of actually trying to encourage students to learn how to ask the right questions, which is, what do I need to get from that box? And I think we do see our mission very much as that.
I think it needs to start earlier. Like, if you look at kids who are learning things online now, they teach themselves things and they find out what they need to learn. And a lot of them do it socially. So they're not just looking up Wikipedia. They'll get on Google Hangout and video chat to their friends and say, how do I build this thing in Minecraft? And they'll go, oh, you do it like this. Like, they will share that information, and then they'll get on the wiki for Minecraft and they'll update it, and everyone can share that information. And I think the key is not just to learn what you want to look for, but also how to assess which information is good. Because you can get information on the internet, but as much as you can get, you know, a scholarly paper about neurochemistry, you can also read some blogs. Yes. And they're not so accurate a lot of the time. I'm saying some blogs are great.
Fiona?
Yeah, thank you. It just demonstrates how cross-disciplinary thinking is important in how we're going to untangle this stuff. You're all from different areas. Yes, I mean, some of the things that people are worried about with use of the social media, and we've heard some of them, but other things like bullying and self-harm and eating disorders and so on. Now, they obviously occurred before this amazing connectivity, but is there evidence that since this social media has been so pervasive amongst young people that these things and these actions have ricocheted up?
I would suggest people would be better positioned to handle that question in terms of the impact that the social network is having
on bullying. I'm actually not aware of the evidence, but I go back to the response I think that Shanton gave to the first question, that these are all social behaviours they're social phenomena, they need a socially informed response. And so, I think like any problem that occurs in society, we do need to actually research it as a serious problem and identify, test, possible ways of treating, gather evidence and treat it as a scientific problem.
In fact, I think some colleagues at the Australian Catholic University in the last couple of years have, early days yet, but suggested that the traditional profile of the schoolyard bully is no longer relevant because it doesn't apply to the cyberbully. Because if you think about it, the cyberbully doesn't have to be the biggest person and doesn't have to have a gang. It could be the tiniest girl with the click of a button in the safety of her room. And so a lot of parents of cyberbullies don't actually believe that their kids can be cyberbullies. But the inherent issue is not about the technology, but it's about the parents having conversations about their kids, about what are you doing spending 8 hours in your room on your smartphone. Right, in the old days when you have a telephone in the house, you would have it in the kitchen so you can, listen in on your kids and what they're saying. But now they take it up to their room and they have access to everywhere and you have no idea. So it's the social
and there is
interaction.
a bit of evidence about online communities and eating disorders, and
Yes.
they're self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
There's a question up here. Comment? Yes.
Hi there. I'm working on a documentary film about this topic, how technology impacts on society. And I wonder if the panel would like to comment on, and this has been mentioned in a lot of the talks, of how the instant gratification does away with contemplativeness. And maybe a second part of that is if you can look facts up on Google and there's this vast access to information, that's not necessarily knowledge, that's not internalizing the facts or building knowledge, it's just accessing the information, and facts on their own are pretty boring. I wonder if there's any comment about those two things.
I noticed you're beside a camera. Are we on your documentary already? Are we on your documentary already? With the camera?
Not yet, no.
We haven't reached the editing suite. That's a bit of delayed gratification there.
So the better you answer the question, more likely you are to be on any documentary.
I think there are legitimate concerns, and we can talk about the instant gratification and is that affecting kids' ability to self-regulate and so on. But the fact is that once they leave their computer and go out into the real world, they're still going to have to learn self-regulation abilities if they're going to get by, right? Because we all need to do that. So again, as long as we're not locking them up in a room for 11 hours a day and we're introducing a bit of balance, and I'm sure those abilities will develop. I think that there's a fine balance between looking at the potential problems associated with the new technology and not looking at it in context, right? Because there's been lots of new technologies that have been introduced in the past that we've all had lots of fear about that haven't, and these fears haven't really come to fruition, like the written word. Socrates thought it would be the end of the world and everyone's going to become stupid, but that hasn't happened. Probably the internet will change the way we interact and some skills will become obsolete.
But it is different. I mean, the point here is about time to contemplate, time to turn information into knowledge. Shenton, I mean, that is an important question.
Yeah, and that's why in my slide I said time is of the essence. We really need to understand how instantaneous things can be and why we need to take time out to think and reflect. And I think a lot of, dare I say, second or third generation Facebook users, are starting to realize that they're not just going to put their status update on what they're eating right now on their update. They will actually think a little bit about what they're saying, because on the internet you are what you write. And it stays forever. And whole generations of young people are now starting to realize that. The early users of Facebook, who were also initially, if you trace back the time, were the first watchers of Teletubbies, were the ones who, if you think about it, Facebook was new, so they put everything up. But, a few years later now, I think the users are more savvy.
It's being pruned.
Yeah.
Question up here.
I was going to make a comment about Facebook, basically instead of the phone. I am 30 and I still live at home, but I admit the countdown has begun. 39 days until I move out.
Big applause, please.
But obviously, because I'm 30, I have my own life. I don't want my parents to know everything. So if I'm struggling, sometimes if I want to talk to one of my friends that I know in real life, that is also a friend on Facebook, the easiest way for me to talk without parents snooping is to have a conversation on Facebook. So obviously, and my grandma is 92. She joined Facebook a couple of years ago when my sister, who's now 23, went overseas. So, of course, anything I post on Facebook, my grandma will read. If I post something at 11:30 at night, just before I go to bed, I might have been at cycling training and broken a personal best and I'm really happy about it. I know that I'll get stick from my grandma the next morning for being up too late. So the grandma test is certainly very good.
Thanks for that.
I want to make the point that it's not just about privacy either. For a lot of people, communicating online is easier and less threatening. People who are very introverted, for example, like to have a lot of control over what they're going to say, and they find it very difficult to speak to people in person because they don't get to edit or consider what they're going to say. So this is kind of calls back to the idea of taking time. And I would say actually on Twitter, there's that stereotype that people just post pictures of their food and talk about what they had for lunch. Almost nobody actually does that because the tweet is so short. You spend a long time, particularly if you're a comedian or someone who's, people listen to what you say occasionally, you spend a lot of time carefully crafting those 140 characters to make sure that they are the funniest they can possibly be. And I think it makes a better joke writer, actually. So there is some consideration there too.
Just before we take more questions, I just want to ask Alex about this face-to-face versus online. You talked about the social groupings and chimps and how that increased networking in the brain. That's a face-to-face. There's this literature on touch and nurturing in babies, how it reduces the stress response. Surely it is going to be different. Even though you do get some support on Facebook from your friends, it is going to be different face-to-face when you can touch somebody.
Sure. I think, yeah. So if you take an extreme example where you raised a child who was only interacting socially online and had no person-to-person interactions, then obviously they're not going to develop the skills that allow you to, read someone's facial expressions, gestures, posture, and so on, right? They're only going to be trying to understand what happens in text. So...
Comes back to your tutor moderation.
Yeah, I guess they're not... Sorry, I got off a plane this morning. My brain's in a slightly devolved state at the moment. Being online in that social environment all the time is not going to be healthy. I don't think anyone would debate that. The question is, what's the optimum range? And you could argue that being able to interact with other people in the world will expose them to more ideas, expose them to a broader diversity of opinions because they're more connected. But obviously they can't be doing that 11 hours a day.
Liam, what's happening on Twitter?
So again, we've got more questions on this idea of the differences between young people and adults in their use of Twitter. We have a question from Twitter user Curly Red Mop Top, who asks...
It's not me.
How do we bridge the techno-social divide between children and adults?
Pip, do you want to click on that one?
Well, I'm encouraged about the 82-year-old, or 92-year-old grandmother on Facebook. I think young people are actually terribly good at managing adults who don't use social media. And in fact, I think they're remarkably adept at picking the channel that works for the moment. They have greater skill than adults in that regard. If adults want to also learn that skill, they can, I think. And it's a choice.
It would be great to learn it from
the young ones. You know, I always say to parents who don't have Facebook, why don't you get your kid to tell you how to use it and be part of it and part of that community? And I get kids going, whoa, don't tell that to our parents. But there are some basic rules for parents who are on Facebook networks with their kids. It's like Saturday.
Don't behave like Kevin Rudd.
No, well, no, it's like Saturday morning soccer. You know, if the kids are playing soccer and they're fine, don't interrupt. Don't run onto the field. If there's an argument, let the referee handle it. Don't make a scene by picking up on your friends, your kids' friends. So don't start arguments with your kids' friends. It's mortifying on Facebook. So it's that social rule.
Impulse control.
Yeah, impulse control for the adults as well.
There are 4 generations of my family on Facebook.
Yeah.
Like my grandmother is on Facebook, my mum is on Facebook, my brother's on Facebook, my nephew's on Facebook. And they do behave differently, but it's not necessarily their understanding of the technology. Like my grandmother is on Facebook, she's got email. I received a LinkedIn request from her a few months ago. I'm fairly sure she didn't do that on purpose, but I love you, Nana, if you're watching. But the fact that she doesn't send me very many emails has got nothing to do with the fact that she doesn't know how to use email. She also never calls me on the phone, despite the fact that I tell her that she should. That's a behavioural thing. Yeah. And like you say, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Don't worry, she's watching you. Yes.
I'm a teacher. I teach ESL, English as a Second Language, and I've got a refugee youth class at the moment. It's been very interesting observing it. On Monday, I'm going to have to set up a Facebook site, not myself. I've got a Middle Eastern newly arrived refugee who'll do it. But it's been interesting because the loneliness became an issue with one student. And I've got some others who in class, because they use the iPhone to check words, they haven't got high levels of English. So there's all sorts of things going on. Also, I mean, could you say I'm over-involved? I think part of my job with them is to engage with sadness and things like that and happiness. But it's been very interesting. People have gone back home, so we're linked up across the world. Often the languages, maybe there's 5, 6, 7, 8 languages on it. And I don't even know how to get people off. And then you've got issues of fairly largely breasted women occasionally put on and how you moderate that. So it's been very interesting, I think, as a classroom teacher, settling people. You know, it'd be really lovely to have someone actually look at it a bit more.
What's your impression? Does it delay their English acquisition because they're not forced to communicate in English?
Well, at times it's in English. On the next Facebook I'll start this week, I think I'm going to make it only in English. It wasn't just set up by me, it was set up by an agency as well, because I'm working with an agency with refugee youth. So they set it up. So as a teacher now, I'm thinking, how do I use it? So next time it won't be. Probably issues of all sorts of religion going on that I'm not sure about what's happening in the different languages. It's quite, I'm not moderating it, there's now a volunteer moderating it. So it's very interesting what's occurring. I don't think I really know. I was concerned about...
So there's a danger here.
Yes, yeah. I was concerned at times about the loneliness issue, and that person came back in. But for me, I can, like, last night I looked at my list of students and I'll look at ones that I'm a little bit worried about and how are you, what's happening, are you working now? Because some of them have left. I think it will be closed fairly soon.
Yes, there's a comment in the middle. Somebody's been sitting patiently with the microphone for a while, yes?
Thanks. I think you all make some great points. I'm just curious about sort of education strategies for those points. I know you've touched upon the youth and a little bit about families, but especially for Dr. Chang's case, educating about the online area. When the people you're trying to educate are probably the ones who are least likely to jump online. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
So we're doing, generally, schools are coming on board and educating the younger generations. I think your question is around how do we educate the older generations? That's why you're here, right? I think it's really hard because there are a lot of people who just see it as this is a thing that is, it's kind of Socrates' attitude towards writing. And I think we need to get over that. And you look at the debate in Australia about NBN. This is one of the few countries in the world where the platform has become, NBN equals, the left, and and cable equals, it's kind of like it becomes a politicized thing rather than actually an understanding. I mean, the reality is we do not know what we are missing because we don't have it. Okay, a lot of Australians think that we don't need NBN because why would you? We're quite happy where we are. But when I try to download some Korean websites, for example, it freezes my computer because we just don't have the capacity. So there is a lot of education that still needs to be done, but generally there's a real lack of understanding about what NBN can actually do, for example, in areas of health, in areas of education, in the quantified self, in helping you manage your own health via smartphones. A lot of potential out there that's still not explored.
Yes.
I just want to make a comment about people's adaptation to getting information from the internet. I work as a social worker at the Children's Hospital in an area of medicine which is very rare.
Just the microphone a bit closer.
Okay, where new parents are getting diagnoses of very rare conditions, which 10 years ago when I started, they'd go straight to the internet to actually Google what this rare, unheard of thing is. And I think in the 10 years that I've been there, they are much more discerning about rushing to the internet. Of course, it was very frustrating for doctors who are giving one explanation of what this might mean and what the prognosis is. Then you go to the internet and there are multiple versions and often the worst possible scenarios. So I think people are actually getting adjusted to not everything that's on the media, on the internet and Google is true and may not apply to them.
But there's a flip side to that. I'll just ask the panel in a minute. There's a flip side, which is that consumers are actually crowdsourcing solutions that doctors don't want to know about, but forcing clinical trials in areas that they've felt hope, that the doctors are nihilistic, there's no hope here, and you've got groups of people coming together. I mean, have you noticed that happening amongst your patients where they're demanding care which actually the crowd is identifying as real?
Not so much in my area because the numbers are so small, but they certainly are using Facebook to actually connect with other families all around the world whose children also have these conditions, and I think that's a very positive thing.
Shant?
I think it's actually an issue because if you remember to one of my slides, Australians generally, we lurk. We read a lot, we don't contribute a lot. So a lot of these families are actually relying on overseas, particularly American sources of information, which has a completely different health system, different names for drugs, even. And so it is a struggle for Australian families trying to get information on health because we don't crowdsource very well. We rely on overseas sources of information.
Why are we lurking?
I think there's something to do with our culture of confidentiality, privacy, and our I wouldn't say paranoia, but we as a culture do not like to share information. It's our privacy is a huge issue. There are so many countries in the world where they have an identity card that's attached to their health records, their passport number, and it's all trackable. Can you imagine us saying yes to that in Australia? Culturally, it's just not happening. So
yes, the question up here.
Yes, I had a question about, you've talked a lot today about self-regulation and what we can do to sort of maintain and control it. Is there a need for a larger governing body of that sort of thing? I mean, we control alcohol by age restriction, cigarettes as well. Do we need that sort of social responsibility?
Alex?
So what was the question? Do we need some kind of legislative regulatory body?
Do we need to have something governing this rather than letting it be self-regulated?
I guess the internet, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I guess you could argue the internet's perhaps a bit more benign than alcohol. But
that's jet lag speaking, isn't it?
So, I'll probably get lambasted for that. But so I wouldn't go so far as to say that usage patterns should be regulated. But I think it is worth considering doing some research into what are good uses of the internet versus bad, and what are productive uses of the internet versus bad. We really don't know yet. I mean, you have this intuitive sense that if you're doing things to expand your knowledge base and learn new things, then it'll be a good thing. But again, when you sort of boil it down, is spending a whole lot of time interacting socially online, is that as good as face-to-face social interactions? The jury's still out.
But Pip, for those people who were here for the earlier session, we had an important presentation on neurosexism. In fact, it won the priority, and which was about predetermined attitudes deciding outcomes of research, which don't necessarily, so the research looks okay. Could we predetermine the outcomes of this research, which leads to the inevitable conclusion that that is dangerous, for example, and should be regulated?
I think there's always a danger that preconceptions can colour the way in which we design the research and therefore find answers which don't really answer the question that's important. As it is for our students, it's the same for us. We need to kind of make sure we frame the question appropriately. Yes, I think our prejudices always run the risk of doing that.
Ben?
I think when you talk about restriction or any kind of governance of a medium, that's difficult. And when you talk about the internet and even just social media, you're not talking about one thing. You're talking about a huge number of things. We've only mentioned like the most popular ones, Facebook and Twitter, but there's also things like Instagram and Snapchat, and you can't regulate all of those, and people will find a way to use them. And I think it's never the problem of the technology that people use to socialise and communicate and spread information between them. It's the problem is what they're using it for and why they're using it. And you can't, you police that in the real world by policing the people. You don't police the technology that is the means of communicating it.
And I think you can augment that by having a legal system that actually starts to explore what sort of digital evidence, like cyberbullying, for example, how do you actually look at that?
In Australia, if somebody threatens you physically via Twitter, that's illegal because that's a threat via a carriage medium. And Twitter is a carriage medium. So a lot of it's actually already there. Like there's this idea that it's completely unregulated and you do things online and there's no repercussions in the real world. There will be if you report people. If you make a complaint about someone who does that to you online, that's just as illegal as if they sent you a threatening letter or wrote a threatening message on your wall or phoned you up and harassed you. It's the same.
So Alex, what about an old-fashioned medium like television or video games and violence? And whether or not, so every week you open your paper, violent videos do affect behaviour, violent videos don't. What's the story here, and should we be regulating that?
The story is complex. It's, as you said, it's very controversial. For every study that finds a negative effect, there's one that finds a positive. It's very hard to do good research in this area. Ideally, you'd take kids at birth, expose one group to violent games, expose another group to non-violent games, and see what happens when they're 20. But unfortunately, we can't do that. I can. Look, it seems like the latest evidence suggests that if you look across the body of evidence that maybe there's a small effect that exposure to aggressive games or television increases propensity for aggressive behaviour, but it's quite a small effect, and so whether that has any practical consequences is unclear.
And it's the sort of person who becomes addicted to it in the first place. Yes, the question is being very patiently waited for up there.
Hi. Just going back to what seems to be a general consensus that there is a lot to be lost when adolescents spend 10 hours a day socialising on the internet, and that there must be something done to regulate or to teach other ways of developing the brain socially. I'm just wondering why it is so easy for adolescents to spend 10 hours a day in their room by themselves when it seems to be, quote unquote, a natural human instinct to be with other people. Like, why is this something we have to fight so hard against?
Good question. Pip?
Can I ask, where are these kids who do that? Because I don't know.
We can't find them because they're in the bedrooms.
Well, I guess so. But like I said, there's 4 generations of my family on the internet, and I know my nephew, for example, uses Facebook a lot. I don't see everything he does on Facebook, but he doesn't use Facebook any more than all my very Facebook-savvy friends. And you'll find that the time you get the most angry about someone not being on Facebook is when you're trying to organise a party or invite people to an event, because they're not there. So you invite everybody else, and now I've got to remember to phone this one person or send them a text message or an email because they're not on Facebook.
I miss out on a lot of parties.
Yeah. So I actually want to question this idea. Like, I don't know where those statistics come from, but when we say that a child is spending 8 to 10 hours on Facebook or social media in general in a day, How does that work?
It's not closed away in a room. Yeah. It's, you know, if you're out and about, on the tram...
you're still in the real world interacting with other people.
Yeah, it's not...
well, bumping into them because you're on your phone. Yeah. Exactly. Do you want to comment, Pip, before we move?
I was just going to say, I think what we're seeing is just an increase in the diversity of the way in which we lead our or transact our social relationships. We don't know an awful lot about what's good and what's bad. I think, but we do have some concerns that certain forms of extreme expression of what's possible may well have bad consequences, but we need to look at it.
Hugh?
Thank you, Norman. Hugh Taylor at the University of Melbourne. I mean, this has been a really interesting series of presentations and discussions, but I'd like to ask a more personal question. I must out myself as a Luddite. I don't use Facebook or Twitter, and I quake when Ben goes through all these new names. I struggle just to keep up with the daily flow of email. And so I shouldn't ask Pip because she hasn't outed herself yet, but Ben clearly has. My first question would be, how much time do you spend in a day on social media? Now, if that answer is embarrassing, don't worry. But my second question would be, what have you given up to have that free up that time to do it?
Sure. I'd ask the other question, what does it free me up to do? Because I'm sitting in front of a computer all day already, working. It does not impact the amount of time I spend writing, researching, sending emails to do all the admin that relates to my job as a freelance guy. It takes no time away from those tasks because it just sits in the background, and it's the same when I've got my phone on me and I'm wandering around. And look, I freely admit I've had that problem that a lot of people do, where I check my phone too often, and it's something that I've addressed in myself in the last 6 months. But I think that's a compulsive behaviour that people will always find an outlet for. I don't necessarily think that it's more addictive than other things that people can find a compulsion to do. And I don't feel like I've given up any of my life to do it. I mean, I'm here today. I spend a lot of time socialising. The thing that has destroyed my social life is being an entertainer, because I work in the evenings and I never see my friends because of that. And so I find it's vital. You know, it reconnects me to my friends who if I had to rely on seeing them physically or speaking to them on the phone, I would almost never get to connect with them because the time that we have free doesn't connect. And I think for a lot of people, and perhaps this is why it's a bit of a generational difference, for a lot of people of my generation and who are younger, and I'm just a Generation Xer, our work patterns and the time that we spend doing things are much less traditional. We don't spend time working between 9 and 5 and free time in the evenings and on weekends. We work and we have leisure time at all kinds of different times of the day and of the week, and reconnecting with our friends and indeed our business partners and connections as well has to be done on a non-physical way, because it has to be mediated at different times.
Hugh, I've got a question for you, actually. What's it doing to the eyesight? Because working on a computer, etc., does increase short-sightedness, doesn't it? And are we seeing an epidemic of visual abnormalities as a result?
Reading books gives you short-sightedness, so I don't know that computers are any worse.
It depends what books you're reading, isn't it?
Well, that's true.
The answer about the computers and in the...
I should explain, Hugh's an ophthalmologist.
Sorry. In the late 70s, when computers started coming in, and newsrooms, example, they threw out all the typewriters, everyone had to have word processors. A lot of union concern about it. And there's no harm from the computer itself. What you need to make sure is you've got the proper glasses, because the distance is different from ordinary reading glasses or distance glasses. So if you've got the right glasses, there's no problem. As far as reading, it's not the time spent at near work that's the problem. It's the time the kids are not spending outdoors with a far distant horizon focused on their peripheral retina. So it's not the whole, it's the donut, if you like. So the kids need to spend at least an hour a day outside with a distant horizon.
No, that's fair. And again, if you're using a smartphone for your primary social media interaction, you will have it with you outside. and you will look, and you don't like, I know there's this parody of people walking around like this, and you do every now and then you see one person who's going to cross the road like that, and you go, okay, don't do that. But most people, I mean, maybe I'm an optimist. I don't think most people are idiots. And people who interact on social media are no more idiotic or smarter than anybody else. And you look at it when you need to look at it, and you look away from it when you need to look away from it. And the fact that your computer is this big, and you can go, oh yeah, oh yeah, put it back in the pocket, means that, you know, the time that you spend, how do you measure that? I don't know how you measure that. If you say you're on social media 8 hours a day, you know, how much of that is 5 seconds looking at your messages in between talking to someone and getting on a tram and reading an actual physical book? Who knows?
So start texting now. There's the numbers. The number is 0429 883 481, and you text that code, and that will automatically register your vote. Those are the propositions. We need to understand that social media are not a social evil. We must engage and understand this whole phenomenon to understand it, to know what's going on better. And tout en modération, Alex's proposition. And please keep your votes coming in. I'll take one more question while we're seeing the votes coming in. You've got 2 minutes left to put in your vote.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really informative.
Just hold the microphone really close.
A little bit off topic, but how do we, you're talking about, you know, time is of the essence and, you know, instant gratification in terms of social media and all the different types of media out there. People are saying that we as a society are having trouble, you know, turning off, you know, being immersed in the moment rather than, you know, looking to the iPad, looking to the smartphone, posting pictures and stuff. Just a question to everyone, how do we, as individuals, would you say, try to, you know, be immersed in the moment rather than be watching through your smartphone or your iPad kind of thing?
Pip, and then I'll just come to the rest of the panel on that question. It's a really good question.
It is a good question. I think humans remain human, so I'm not sure how much we really need to do here. I think, as I said, there are extremes we need to watch, but I actually think people are finding good ways of using media that allow them to be their social selves. I think there is a question about whether you stop looking for answers if you can't find the answer immediately, and I think that is something that does need social development and steering. But other than that, I think people's natural reactions is actually quite a social one, and in that respect, we haven't seen such enormous change.
An interesting tussle occurring on the screen there between moderation and not being a social evil. Just make your votes. You've only got 15 seconds to go. Shanton?
There's an interesting place in Japan called the Studio Ghibli Museum. And those of you who ever watch Japanese animation, Studio Ghibli does these amazing things. But if you go to the museum, they have a policy that you have to experience it, please, no technology. So you can't actually take photos, you can't actually do your smartphone, they actually ask you to engage. It is the noisiest place on earth, because people actually talk, kids are running around and playing and interacting. I don't know that that's a positive, because I wanted a quiet moment. But it's about a balance, you know, if you completely ban it, or if you say just go for it, I think it's all about what you're saying, it's about moderation. I think if you're sensible about what is appropriate and what's not, and then you just go for it, I think that's what you need.
Alex?
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, this idea that things are more immediate, I mean, I guess, you know, when the telephone was invented, communication was a lot more immediate than it ever was previously, right? So back to Shanton's example, instead of writing a letter of complaint, you could call them up and abuse them on the phone. But, you know, 50 years on, we don't think that we've all lost our frontal lobes and we're completely dysregulated, right, because of the telephone. And so I think society will adapt to this technology. And I think, you know, at a certain level, I think there's a bit of a hysteria that all these technologies are happening and we're just kind of passively going along with the flow. But at a certain level, there is the power of the individual, right? And you'll never have the time if you don't take the time. And so you need to kind of just set some boundaries for yourself about when you use these. Well, I'm not going to check my email for the next 4 hours because the world's not going to explode. You know, things will still be okay, and just allow yourself some mental health breaks from the constant bombardment.
Benjamin?
You know, I'm a live performer and I love live performance, and when you go to see a live performance, I think it's self-correcting, because if you go to a music concert and there's people in the front row as there was for quite a long time with their smartphones trying to video it like this in front of your face, that's a self-correcting problem because the people standing behind them are going to punch them. And people will learn, And I think, yeah, it's important to know when to switch off. And I think we all, I think, in fact, it's quite a very gratifying experience in itself to make the conscious decision to say, you know what, I'm going to turn my phone onto airplane mode or just turn it off while I'm taking a walk in this park, or doing something physical. And I find that all the time. I ride a bicycle a lot. Obviously, I'm not using any kind of smartphone while I'm doing that. And I love it. I love experiencing the world around me like that. So I think we all will do it more.
So the highest priority put in this room is that we should remove prejudice from our thinking in this area so that wiser heads can actually harness the technologies and indeed study them, which in fact is what all three of our speakers have been saying in one way or another. Shannon just had a few more jokes. But thank you for that, because that will be fed into tomorrow's Democracy Day. Before I get you to thank the panel, we need to clear the room, just to freshen ideas and stuff out in the room, but we need to actually clear this lecture theatre if you don't mind. So if you wouldn't mind leaving after this, that would be great, and have your conversations in the foyer. But before that, please thank our fantastic panellists.